Welcome to Reboot 2030, the Democracy School's YouTube channel. This is a new season of Reboot dialogues and interviews, building on last autumn's pilot series, where we had 5 dialogues over a period of 5 weeks. We have, since last autumn, we have developed the concept a little bit further. This season, we have regular guests. If you have followed us last autumn, you will recognize the names. But we've also got some additional guests. The idea is that in future, people will enter Reboot as discussants, as additional guests. And if at the end of a Reboot interview, we feel that there's more in it and that we want to expand it, then we develop it into a Reboot dialogue, and then they become regulars. So for this season, so far, we have got 9 discussants, 9 live streams over 9 weeks. And it looks like a really exciting program on topics ranging from European and global democracy, touching on the conflicts in Eastern Europe, the war in Ukraine, and of course on the climate crisis, which has been pushed into the background as it so often happens when there is an immediate crisis blaring up. So we will also look again at educational reform and other topics. So it should be a very broad, informative and exciting program. If you want to have a look at the program, you'll find it at democracyschool.com/news. And there you'll find a blog post entry, Reboot 2030 Spring Program. Do have a look at that. It'd be great if you follow us throughout the season. Now, let me bring on online our guest for today, Young-Jin Choi. He has been, he's a regular. He's been here last season already, and his main topic is to reduce our carbon footprint through sort of economic means, economic policy, and he has developed quite a thing around this whole notion of climate pricing, carbon pricing, and the carbon dividend. So let me bring him on and introduce him to you. There he goes. Let's see whether he's coming on. Okay, it's loading. It's loading, and there he is.
Hi, Nico.
Good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, fairly well. Thanks. How about yourself?
Yeah. I'm glad the communications have worked out in the end. You have changed jobs. So congratulations to your new job. Young-Jin, let me just very briefly introduce you. You are now head of impact at VDR Equity. This is a kind of a move, I believe, from a sort of a not-for-profit gig previously to something that is very much for-profit. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that's fair to say. But it's the same area, which is impact investing, right? So before I was more on the impact investing advisory side, specialized on impact measurement and management, and now I'm applying it in practice for climate impact.
Oh yes, absolutely. You're in the boiler room, as they say. You're kind of you're kind of turbocharging, kind of the green businesses of the future. That's brilliant. I mean, somebody has to do this, and of course, it's an exciting time to be in that kind of clean tech field. Before you were with VDR Equity, you were at Finio, which has a very different profile. We just touched on it. It's a non-for-profit. But you were again in this whole impact research field, weren't you? So you were kind of looking at similar issues, but from a different perspective. Can you just sort of very quickly tell me the difference between sort of a not-for-profit and a for-profit approach?
Yeah, I mean, so actually, more at Fineo, I was more in a think tank and thought leadership capacity, and I was actually focusing more on climate impact over the past 1 or 2 years, perhaps. So it was important for me to also try to understand in more in depth, how we can measure also indirect and systemic impacts, which and collective impacts. So all these concepts of impact measurement and management that are evolving now, as since I would say the conventional impact management measurement practice is also establishing itself, more broadly. So yeah, trying to think ahead, and now is really, it also included some consulting work and advisory work. So Fineo also, as a nonprofit, had a business or activities, which were paid, and but which contributed to the whole mission. And here it's a mix, right? It's very mission driven, yeah. But that's maybe the difference, that there is for-profit incentive too. Yeah.
What kind of investments are you broadly? I mean, as an investment firm, what kind of investments are you looking at?
Yeah, so really, we want to invest in climate solutions. Looking for mid-sized companies in the focused on the German Mittelstand, if you will, right? Oftentimes further upstream the value chains of important sectors like renewable energy, circular economy, electrification. But coming myself with having the background in engineering, mechanical engineering, and also being interested in material science, for example, and technology platforms and so on, it's an exciting field to be in, and to see more mature companies also who are already commercially operating.
So if somebody was to look for investment, what kind of profile would that company have to be of interest to you guys?
So already mid-sized profile, I mean. Yeah, it's a very rough indication is maybe revenues above, between 30 and 300 million euros per year, something like that.
Okay.
Yeah, or also a profitable EBIT higher than 4 to 5 million euros ideally.
Okay.
Yeah, and with a substantial share or significant share of the business with a climate solution that is competitive and needs to scale, where we can help.
Okay, so really, it's kind of from round A onwards, isn't it? You wouldn't be looking at
much later than that. It's really established companies. It's companies that are there, can be there for decades, or even
Okay. So this isn't even about preparing people for IPOs. So it's literally.
So it's established companies. So it can be clean tech startups from 20 years ago or 10 years ago if they have scaled, right, and been operating. But oftentimes it's really older companies that are part of the Mittelstand.
Okay, excellent. And you're investing mainly your own money, or are you working with pension funds and with other kind of investment companies?
Yeah, lots of institutional investors.
Yeah. Excellent. Great. Okay, so before that, you worked in management consulting, and of course before that, again, you worked investment banking. So you don't have this very clear sort of finance investment kind of background with an engineering kind of angle to it. So what brings you into this whole climate field? I mean, you're kind of almost exotic, aren't you, in that sense?
Yeah, maybe it's I think the maybe most important part for me was the systems design, systems thinking part of it. So both when I was trained in mechanical engineering, we had systems engineering, and also in business studies, we had a course on systems design, but much less technical, but very fascinating. And I think in general, I was fascinated by also social sciences and how systems play a role there and are defined, and there are system dynamics that apply to mechanical systems, but also to social systems too. So with that in mind, when I look at this, climate crisis, it's to a large part a systems design problem. If you look at our economic system, our financial system. So I'm from an investment perspective. I think it's straightforward to understand what to do, but I think there are certain limitations that you have as an investor, at the system level, where structures and incentive, systems play a huge role. So if you look at how the economic system is designed, and there is a legal framework behind it, there is a corporate law that defines the purpose of the corporation. But these are, systems that were designed, in the last century or even before, when the climate crisis didn't play a huge role, and they are not fit for purpose yet. We can see that you can do as much as possible as an investor, but you will get, as long as, for example, certain important climate mitigation investments are not sufficiently profitable, because the market structure, the market incentives don't allow for it to be profitable at this stage, due to the colossal market failure of, being with negative impacts of carbon emissions and externalities not being priced in by the market. So we have a situation where lots of investments that are urgently needed cannot take place because they're not economically feasible. So we have a huge climate finance gap. There's an analysis by the Climate Policy Initiative that anticipates a need for $4.3 trillion per year by 2030. And currently we are, between 630 and 700 billion per year. So globally, we need to, scale this up substantially, increase it sixfold at least.
And what do you think will be the drivers? What will enable that scaling up? I mean, climate change, as urgent and as current as it is, it's not new. We've known this for, at least for the last 40 to 50 years. And we haven't really moved much beyond kind of accepting that it is a problem. So this in a way kind of brings us to this next question: what can we do? And one kind of idea that you are promoting is this idea of a sort of a carbon a carbon tax.
It's a combination of carbon pricing and climate income. How you increase the price on carbon, whether it's through a tax or emissions trading, as long as the effective price increases for carbon emissions, you want to have this effect that in the market, climate solutions, low carbon technologies become more competitive relative to high carbon technologies, right? You want to want to have less of carbon emissions, so let's make it more expensive, but it has to be sufficiently expensive to have really an economic effect, right? So in the end, it means that new fossil fuel exploration projects can't be that profitable as they are. They're highly profitable at this point still, right? But at the same time, and this is the other part of it, I think it's really important to use the revenues that are generated by carbon pricing for climate income, to ensure that consumer households are not negatively affected by the increasing prices for carbon-intensive goods and services, because they need time to switch. They actually need additional support to make investments, in low carbon technologies. It's not just electric mobility, but it's a heat pump, it's a solar, the photovoltaics on your rooftop, the solar thermal, and then after a certain transition period, I think you're not affected anymore by high carbon prices, right? But to soften this transition, you need the climate income, and you need to support especially the more vulnerable lower middle income households to ensure the support that you need publicly and politically, right?
That's right. We have a really interesting situation, a very real life situation at the moment, where this whole debate about should we cut oil and gas from Russia and the impact that would have on prices, and you can see very different responses to this across Europe and across the world. Some of them are ideologically driven, and some of them are economically driven. But there is certainly in Germany there is a great hesitancy to let go of Russian oil and gas, because of course if we do, it's not that there wouldn't be any more oil and gas for us, but we'd have to pay probably significantly more for it. So wouldn't this be a time where we could sort of say, well, yeah, let's make that jump, but let's bring at this point in the climate income, the carbon dividend, because that could indeed be a way and bring it in like at an industrial or kind of a business to business level, so that the German Mittelstand would wouldn't that be really a kind of a moment that one would want to seize, an opportunity?
Yeah, it's certainly a moment to accelerate the transition and to double down on renewable energy expansion and so on, and not try not to expand liquefied natural gas infrastructure, not to build new terminals. I mean, I see it's a difficult situation because this change has to happen so suddenly now. If we had started 10 years ago, wouldn't be such a big problem, right? But now we have this crunch, and we have to think ahead, make wise decisions and not lock ourselves into something that we don't want and don't need. If we had a climate income, it would be much easier for, of course, for households to deal with the increased gas prices. Right now, there's a huge social burden, right? Yeah, so I think it shows us that what benefits we could have had we started, earlier with the transition, and that we have to start now. It's long overdue. Yeah.
But isn't there another aspect to this? I mean, as I said, we've seen this. This has been a long way coming. It's no surprise that we have to scale back on oil, gas, and fossil fuels. Generally speaking, this has been like sort of a campaigning issue for decades now, and so, but a lot of lip service has been paid to kind of, in a way, engage with those campaigning demands. Yes, we will, but we need to, and so on and so forth. So now that this point has actually come where we would actually have to do it, it's all of a sudden too sudden. So there is, of course, because it'll always, whenever you do start, there will be this point where you have to jump, won't there? I mean, there's just no, at some point you have to basically make that move. The question is are we at all willing as a society to do this, or are we learning at the moment the hard way that actually we're not willing to do this? I mean, if you look at the Green Party in Germany, for example, they're in government. We have a green minister of the economy, and we, and a capable one too. He's a great guy. But I don't hear them make that. I make them make the kind of the patriotic argument that we should be, supplying, heavy arms and this and that we should be probably cutting oil and gas, but I don't really hear them make the positive case so strongly. The case, that this would actually not to look at it as a threat, as something, a crisis that needs managing, but to look at it in a positive way, to look at it as an opportunity that we have to grasp with both hands. And I don't really see the Green Party do this at the moment. Do you have any insight why they might be so hesitant?
Oh, that's difficult to tell for me. It's from my point of view, but what I see is that currently there is, on the one hand, you have oil and gas lobby that is trying to use the situation to their advantage. On the other hand, the climate movement is also making a very strong argument, for accelerated transition. And the new, I think there's a Easter package, the supporting renewable energy expansion. Germany also looks okay, looks decent, like a contribution. And so we are currently in the situation where we have different interests fighting for future investments in new infrastructure, and where I can only hope and do what I can as in personal capacity, and we must do this to ensure that we don't follow the fossil fuel path for the next
I mean, there is a sort of from an economic viewpoint, there is a sort of the room for maneuver certainly for the German Mittelstand isn't that great, so that there comes a point when German manufacturing simply isn't competitive anymore, where it's actually costing money to keep the factory going just because of the high energy prices. So there is a kind of a point where we're actually literally destroying the economy. But the question is and of course, on the one hand, on the other hand, for instance, the American oil and gas industry has never done better. I mean, they've never ever produced as much oil and gas.
Profiting,
unbelievable. And the margins and the kind of the prices are just. I mean, this is a total seller's market. So they are basically laughing all the way to the bank. And of course, the Mittelstand, the kind of small to medium-sized businesses who cannot hedge energy prices in the same way as a global enterprise might be able to, but they are getting squeezed in a bad way. So from an economic standpoint, and I'm not advocating kind of a managed economy here, but do you think that there is a strong argument coming up for sort of a managed energy transition, where we have to say, well, we can't leave it all to the market, because clearly we may find that the market actually isn't going to do it, that we have a choice between running with the market or literally just and destroying the environment.
I would call it the publicly supported transition, perhaps. The market doesn't allow for it now, and there is a need for public, support, financial support for subsidies and so on to, help industry electrify earlier than possible, and also to try to accelerate, all the low carbon solutions, green hydrogen, including, to come earlier to market than is currently the case. But so it's a case for mission-driven accelerating funding. And also, I wanted to mention, when I talked about the carbon pricing earlier, it's actually something that I also realized since our last conversation. It's just a negative. So it's one side of the coin, which is increasing, the prices and costs for fossil fuel consumption. But you also, at the same time, which is much more maybe powerful in combination, is a carbon reward. You want to reward actually climate mitigating activities, successful, sequestrations of carbon and reductions of carbon. And so there was this project called Global Carbon Reward. I think we will talk about this too, right?
It's going to be one of our discussions, absolutely.
Important part of the whole package, policy package, and it also needs to include other climate policies, green fiscal spending, and standards, regulations, everything that helps accelerate the transition.
I mean, what and sort of leading on to this sort of this, if you like, the topic of the day. I mean, I think one thing that in this kind of discussion we're having right now, we're finding is that we are kind of, it's very easy to go in circles. It's very easy to kind of, because it's so hard to find a way forward. There's so many forces that can, cancel each other out, and so many interests that work against each other. It's a very complex situation, market situation, and it's very hard through policy, through conscious and through managed policy, to find a way through this, because there are all these unintended consequences and so on and so forth. So obviously there are reasons why we haven't moved faster than we have over the last 30 years, and it's not just all down to ill will. I mean, there has been also good intentions, but it hasn't been enough. So one issue that we kind of came to in our previous discussion is we kind of need to, in a way, it's a bit like when you're in the forest and you don't have a compass, at what point you begin to think you went astray, you're lost. You kind of say, oh, gee, we've been here before. Oh, we've been here before. And this kind of sense of not actually making any progress is damaging, in two ways. A, because if you don't make progress, it's really bad. And also it's really bad for morale, because we're kind of feeling, oh, we've been going for so long and we're still, so we may as well just give up. So this idea came up, but if we could somehow monitor, if we could get a handle on what are the drivers of progress, and what are the risk indicators along the way, and what are the opportunity costs that sort of like we have to manage and consider, that if we do this, that we kind of get more of a sense of a compass, if you like, more of a sense of the distance we've traveled. So following to our conversation, I spent a little time to think about a broader theme, which is civilizational progress, and how it could be defined and how it could be measured, which I think is also was very fascinating, but important to understand the context within which the climate crisis is taking place. And when we ask ourselves, why is it that for 30, 40 years we didn't really do enough to transition, to transform? There's so many reasons behind it, but including a certain economic paradigm, which in the end also led us to for many years underestimate the damages and costs of the climate crisis. We underestimate the risks of the climate crisis, and this was what policymakers got. But not to forget and not to mention this very important misinformation and corporate antisocial, I have to say, lobbyism activities of the mostly fossil fuel industry. But being I think if we had
as a democracy been very, much stronger than we are currently, because we are weakened. We could have taken action 30 years ago, 20 years ago, much stronger action than now. But so civilizational progress was for me the basically, let's say, the theme within which I identified very many different dimensions of progress. It's not just the progress that we made from an agrarian society to a post-industrial information society, and then to what is coming now. I think we, when you look at it from a also climate with the climate crisis in mind, we have to recognize that the society that we are currently that we have established is an unsustainable one. It's largely fossil fuel powered, and while we have seen a lot of progress, in certain dimensions like general literacy and life expectancy and GDP increase and so on, I think that's becoming clear now. It has been a borrowed progress. We borrowed it from the future, and now we have entered a different stage in human history where it's also becoming clear that it's a time of crisis, of also unprecedented crisis, in very multiple dimensions. I don't have to mention all the crises we are now, but the outlook has become much more grim than it was used to in the past. We have declining, wage levels, living standards, and increasing wealth gap and so on. Now, but coming back to what progress might mean, I think so we have to look at it from a climate, from a lens, or which includes perhaps most important metric of progress, at least until we have solved the climate crisis. It's really the atmospheric concentration of CO2 in parts per million. We have, if you look at the data, it's very nicely shown. Since 1960, over the past 60 years, added 100 parts per million, from roughly 320 to 420. That has happened in such a short time period when we consider how usually in geological timeframes these kind of developments happen, and hasn't happened for millions of years, right? So it's really a severe human intervention in the Earth system, and we have basically moved the Earth system outside of a safe operating zone, and the climate science is telling us, and Earth system dynamics, which is fascinating but also frightening, is telling us that there is a possibility of longer term cycles that we are entering, since we are in this dangerous zone where tipping points are starting a hothouse Earth dynamic, which may take place over thousands of years, and where over this time frame we will see unprecedented temperature increases, but also sea level rises that we cannot imagine today, right? So it's something we have to keep in mind too, and this is also already indicating what we may need to see progress. So it's the long-term view, right? Thinking what does it take to think generations ahead, 100 years ahead, 1,000 years ahead. It's something that we haven't been doing very well yet as a society. So coming back, the most important metric of progress is ppm of CO2, and it's very clear that we have to reduce it until the end of the century, maybe also until the 22nd century. We have to reach net zero by 2050, ideally, which is only a milestone, because if we want to get the atmospheric concentration of CO2 down, we have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We have to get down from today 420 to the safe zone of 350 and below. Again, we basically restore the atmospheric concentration before industrialization began. That is our task for the 21st and 22nd century, if you look at it from the big picture view, right? And there's and of course, emissions, global emissions of greenhouse gases, including CO2, are the main variable that you can derive out of that. So I mentioned net zero by 2050. That also includes, if you think about that, negative emissions, something on the order of perhaps 20 gigatons by the end of the century, negative emissions. It's a huge scale if you think about it, right? And this can be further broken down into certain, let's say, milestones. And I think if you look at the IEA net zero emissions report, it also has one chart where we can see beautifully several milestones on our way to net zero 2050. So I can say we focus first on becoming carbon neutral as a society, and then and this is what I think could be described as a transition from an unsustainable civilization to a sustainable civilization that is actually operating within the safe boundaries, planetary boundaries. But it's not enough, right? Because we have to then further reduce emissions or atmospheric concentration. So we have to become a regenerative civilization. Regenerative meaning restoring, repairing, healing. In ecological terms, there's a much broader, there are many dimensions to being regenerative, social, there's a cultural dimension that I also like to explore. But staying on the climate issue for now, it's clear that we cannot allow new fossil fuel explorations and new fossil fuel powered, production capacity. But it's what's happening, right? So this is one of those milestones where I think progress has been achieved when new fossil fuel exploration ceases to.
I mean, in a way, there's two sets of issues here, isn't there? There's the kind of the what issues. What do we need to do? And you've been talking about the what here, but there's also the how issue, and it's the how where we've encountered the problem. I think on the what, there is global agreement. I don't think there's much disagreement on the what, not what needs to happen. It's the how do we get there? And in a way,
so there's several things to the how. So I mentioned the net zero emissions report by the IEA. So first is no new fossil fuel capacity. Then renewable energy needs to expand drastically, right? So we need by 2030 more than 1,000 gigawatts annual solar wind additions, according to the IEA model. We need 70% electricity production by 2050 by solar and wind alone, for example. So these are the kind of, but you have another dimension, which is climate finance, right? I mentioned the climate finance gap. So scaling up climate finance to $4.3 trillion annually by 2030. And this all hopefully translates into increasing electric market share, electric product market share, like electric vehicles by 2030 reaching 60% global market share, which is a huge transition, very ambitious. Same with electric heat pumps, 50% by 2045, according to the IEA. And then we need, to make this all happen, it's important to have climate policy, which includes a global carbon price, average carbon price of at least, $75 by 2030, for example. But global average, right? Right now, the global average is substantially lower. It's less than $5 per ton, if you consider that most is not even covered by a carbon pricing scheme today in the world. And we need I think good resource to measure progress is the Climate Action Tracker. Climate Action Tracker has on its website is calculating an emissions gap, for 2030, for example, looking at current policies and pledges. And the emissions gap is massive. It's still, I think, something like 19 gigatons by 2030 that have not been, covered, addressed by concrete climate policies yet, and we have to reduce it down to zero. And then I think another dimension is the climate urgency awareness in the general population. And I think what would be reasonable targets, something like 20 to 25% of the population being, really climate activists, for example, is what you need to create a critical mass, for example, or maybe at least 50% of the population being activist or alarmed, or even more being activist, alarmed, or concerned, So there are these different levels that the Yale Communication group has developed, ranging from alarmed, concerned, over to.
That's actually a really interesting matrix, to be honest, because.
But activists not included. So I added activists as in, even more than alarmed.
But I think that's, I think that kind of thinking, that kind of matrix is really important, because I think it does start with mindset, doesn't it? I mean, you know, I think we see this. I mean, this is kind of getting back to like the earlier part of this discussion. You know, we see if the mindset isn't really there yet, not really formed, then it looks very sudden that we want to basically no longer have Russian oil and gas, and that we see this as a threat because our mindset hasn't actually adjusted to a low fossil fuel economy. So we're still on the other side of that fence. We haven't actually crossed that line and then kind of try to find a way of surviving there. We're still on the other side and kind of contemplating what it might be like on the other side. So, I think that's in a way the kind of matrix I have in my mind at the moment is that there's kind of three sort of levels, and the kind of policies, the kind of schemes we kind of in a way want to encourage. And I think the idea of sort of of carbon pricing and a climate income is a beautiful one because it reaches across all of three of these kind of levels. There is the kind of the global level, you know, when we're really looking at sort of multilateral agreements and at the messy world of, you know, COP meetings and so on and so forth. And it's a kind of, it's the Wild West of decision making. There's very few rules. People break them all the time, and it's a difficult layer. Then there is this sort of national layer, and you get massive variance there. You get kind of like environmentally responsible countries or more responsible, and you get total polluters, and you get everything in between. And then you get that individual level, and so you have these three levels. So the you know, the population or the individuals within it, the nation state, and then the kind of the global level. And the European Union kind of sort of sits between the global and the national, and you've got other supranational organizations like World Trade Organization and others who again sort of sit in between that, or you know, the G7, the G20, and all these people. But in a way, they're all kind of trying to mediate between national interest and kind of like, you know, sort of. So if we take these three levels, you know, the individual, the nation state, and kind of planet Earth, the global level. And we think about you know, measuring effectiveness of an idea, like for example, you know, like carbon pricing. We can sort of see, well, it's an interesting one because it allows for a kind of the market to kind of organize itself globally. It's great because it deals with the messiness of global decision making in a kind of interesting way.
But even that requires coordination and cooperation at the international level. You know, you have fortunately mechanisms like carbon border adjustment mechanisms, you know, that help to you know, even limit carbon pricing. If it's limited to a certain region, you can still you know, at least to some extent, adjust for differences and you know, basically incentivize other countries who don't have a carbon pricing yet to, you know, include one as well, because otherwise they would have to pay tariffs and so on. So it's a good example for how you can see different countries can move at different speeds, but it's important to at least have some kind of climate club of the biggest polluters, of the most determined, you know, countries that start with, you know, creating the incentives and changing incentive structures. But actually, I wanted to build on your earlier point about mindsets, because one aspect, one thought that came to mind is that civilizational progress has also a cultural dimension, a cultural philosophical dimension, and one which is difficult to measure. You know, when the title is "What's difficult to measure," you know, it cannot easily be managed, but it's important to be aware of it and also to appreciate certain, you know, the qualitative aspects of it. And also, I think when you think about what's the difference between an unsustainable civilization that we have now and how would that look like in a regenerative civilization, you know, one that is and some kind of, you know, of course, there's an utopian quality to it, you know, but there are certain things that come to mind, like how do we define happiness? You know, right now in a sustainable civilization, it's very closely linked to material, you know, ownership, wealth, and monetary terms. But you know, there's a lot of wisdom in redefining happiness to you know, to human connection, to social justice, and having, you know, advanced needs, self-realization, and so on being met. So this is just one dimension, happiness. And the other one, which is very important, I think, is also the relationship between man and nature, you know, humankind and nature. And in an unsustainable civilization, it's really an exploitative, relationship that humankind exploits nature and dominates it. Whereas in a regenerative civilization, it's again, trying to get back to the earlier harmonic state where we recognize interdependence, and we try to restore and reconciliate with nature and try to, find our place again, for example. So, you can see these are the dimensions which are which is important to reflect on. Another one is the, for example, self-identity. Very important, because if we want international cooperation to happen, I think it's important to also for us, for our generation, to learn to identify ourselves as members of the human species. This is something that because we have different ways of self-identity. In many cases, they are very individualistic or nationalistic or tribal, but it's not the only one. Of course, we're all human beings, right? And so, if we were more aware of this common, shared purpose, shared destiny, and the commonality that we all share, and there's also a community of life which we are part of, right? So, trying to, having a wider scope of our self-identity allows for more kind of universal empathy, right? It's which is currently otherwise limited to members of your own group or tribe, but you have to expand that to global and intergenerational empathy. And this is also a requirement for the kind of cooperation that we need in the long-termism. Yeah, this is something that is one of those examples. So in the end, it's the circle of compassion and the ability to cooperate on an international level to leave the current state of anarchy between nation states. It's something that is holding us back, really, which is creating huge security risks, the geopolitical rivalry, risk of armed conflicts. We have this state of anarchy because we have no supranational effective governance, because the ones that we have, the International Court of Justice, we have, I think, the early ideas, of a United Nations that actually was supposed to, govern for peace, but is currently not capable of doing so because it needs to be reformed, right? So I think progress and regenerative civilization can be recognized that we finally have managed to leave that state of anarchy between nation states and, have an effective supranational governance in place, and also one that allows for much stronger legal standing of future generations of nature, of climate refugees. They need to have legal standing that can be supranationally enforced. This is what progress should look like in the end.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I find this, when you need to buy a new computer, very few people, myself included, for many years. In fact, I'm still likely to go for the fastest machine I can afford, but there is this kind of thing that to play it safe, we just go for the best thing we can afford, or the fastest thing, or whatever, rather than really asking ourselves, the same goes for mobile phones and for other kind of gadgets and other things, rather than asking ourselves, what actually are my needs? I mean, like if I'm not a gamer, if I'm not, like a YouTuber or whatever, I don't need fast processing speed. If it's just a typewriter, then a much more simple machine would do. That would also consume far less energy. And this goes for almost all things. I mean, we're debating again a speed limit on cars, yeah? So why do we still produce cars? I mean, Germany is the only country that doesn't have a speed limit. So why do we still produce cars that kind of go like, 180, 190, 200 or more miles an hour, or whatever, 250, 300 kilometers an hour? Why are we doing this? This is that mindset. As understandable as it is, and as sexy as it is to have a fast car and a fast computer and the latest this and the latest that, if we cannot move from that mindset to another mindset that doesn't make us feel inferior, or doesn't make us feel like we're hippies, or we're kind of, we're sort of oddballs or outcasts, or, if we can't find a sort of a lifestyle model that doesn't build on maximum consumption, we're kind of doomed. And I believe, and it's a difficult thing to to kind of to align with, you know, sort of like foundational values of capitalism, because it builds very much around generation of needs and exploitation of differential and so on and so forth. So how do we you know, this is the thing. So where it becomes very, very difficult. And I wonder whether there is a sort of, I mean, I do believe there could be a milder form of capitalism. And I do believe the kind of work you guys are doing is very much needed, you know, so I'm not arguing against that at all. But at the same time, I see the contradictions in it. You know, I see that, you know, like really like a kind of a world that's based on extraction, whether we're extracting financial value or whether we're extracting resources.
It's not regenerative, right? So what we clearly need is a great transition from an unsustainable civilization into a regenerative one. But I think there is a step in between. Like if we have to reach net zero emissions first, we have to become a sustainable civilization first. I think we can use this step in between to modify the current form of capitalism that is unsustainable to become sustainable, and then from there it's a smaller step to become regenerative, you know. But so when you think in two phases, the first transition to a sustainable civilization that is low carbon and so on, once we have managed to, you know, change the incentive structures and legal frameworks and so on, so that we have, which also includes, by the way, some kind of legal standing for future generations in nature. You know, ecocide law is currently being discussed. So these are, at the horizon at least, developments that point at the regenerative, you know, civilization. But there may be interim steps where we first have to establish a legal standing and then make sure that they can be effectively enforced in the future, you know, as a next step, right? But this is, I think, already transforming also the economic system to such an extent that it's you know, much more easy to imagine regenerative forms.
So a last concept within this concept I'd like to address. So I mean, my sense is in terms of measuring progress, we're coming up against a number of difficulties. One is that it's very, very difficult to sort of extract the actual units of measurement, to sort of say we're going to go for this, and for example in the cultural field, I mean, people have applied the sort of the kind of concepts of sort of social capital to cultural capital and so on and so forth, and you can model things around using these ideas, but it's difficult because there's still arbitrary choices involved, but the other thing more fundamental about measuring progress in that context, I think, is when you're talking not about something linear, but when you're talking about something that is transformative, potentially revolutionary, then progress gets sort of kind of scrambled, doesn't it? I mean, it's because it isn't linear either. So so there's an issue in terms of how do we, I mean, you sort of said in our previous conversation, the point will come when the transition just happens, you know, that there is going to be this magical point, this tipping point when we're kind of when we're waking up, kind of thing.
Societal tipping point, hopefully at some point, not too late. That's the thing. No, but I think we can. There are certain proxies we can apply that maybe not. You know, I think if you look at something like short-termism versus long-termism, difficult to measure, but there are maybe indications that show, oh, you know, this is a society that is planning for the long term, right? I mean, even if we were really taking net zero by 2050 serious, you know, this is already showing we have expanded our time horizon at least by that time, and we are thinking about you know, the end of the century too, increasingly, you know, but maybe we have need, and this is another, of course, a very important aspect, to replace GDP as a measure of success, right? So a sustainable civilization is purely focused on GDP and doesn't, you know, is not capable of recognizing all the externalities that are undesirable. And so what's better, there is, you know, the planetary boundaries adjusted human development index, for example, which might serve as a proxy. In the end, ideally, we have some kind of genuine progress, you know, not maybe indicator, but indicators, and understand that it cannot be just, you know, expressed in one number, but that we have to think about progress in multiple dimensions, you know, including cultural, including, you know, justice and supranational law and global governance and democracy. You know, how can we measure the quality of public discourse, that it's rational, science-based, you know, sound, fact-based? I think we know it when we see it, or not all, but this is the kind of a quality of democracy that is, I think we can identify indicators that show us, okay, this is getting into the moving into the right direction, and we know already right now we are not there, right? We have an indication that the quality of public discourse has deteriorated substantially over the past decade.
Yeah, it has. This is one last aspect in this context I'd like to address. So if it's kind of difficult to say whether we are kind of moving closer to sustainable future, maybe one other way, or kind of a complementary way of kind of monitoring, or sort of something, is to look at risk. So the idea there could be to sort of say, well, how could we ensure that we move away, rather than moving towards a better future, we're moving away from current risks. So we can, so this is mitigation against current risks. This is, and we can, these risks come in different forms and shapes. But if we identify risks and say this and this and this and this are risks, the closer we get to that position, the more exposed we are to that risk.
Of course. I mean, stranded asset risk is a very, salient example, and it's currently at unsustainable levels. And we are still increasing stranded asset risk by continuing to, invest in fossil fuel exploration. And another aspect of risk is very, very, relevant today. Nuclear war, risk of nuclear war is indicated by the bulletin of the atomic, the atomic doomsday clock, so to say, right? It has moved towards midnight even over the past several years, and now of course it's very closer maybe than it has ever been, right? There is biodiversity risk of mass extinction coming this century, right? And something that is not decreasing but increasing. Of course, it's very closely linked to increasing global temperatures and so on. But there are many. I think also this is important when we think about risk. It's important not to limit ourselves to the financial risk in the sense of the financial assets that may be impaired due to extreme weather events, but it's much broader than that. There are cascading societal risks that lead to water stresses, food shortages, and armed conflicts and so on, right? So these are societal secondary effects of rising temperatures that also are difficult to quantify in terms of their economic damages, right? But very real, and so in a way the damages are incalculable,
And so I mean, sort of just to conclude this, I mean, the question that I was wondering when we left our last conversation, and that I was kind of trying to come to terms with in this conversation is there a way that we can use our frustrations, if we can structure and kind of express them through data, to use it as a stick, if you like, so that because of course policymakers, for very clear political short-term reasons, will always find a way of putting a sort of a positive spin on quite difficult situations, and that kind of in a way can be counterproductive, because of course you can only sustain that for so long. At some point it just is no longer credible.
Of course, there's a physical reality that cannot be denied,
So the question is could climate activists, by being more rigorous about plotting their kind of their lack of progress, if you like, however they do that, whether they do that at a sort of at a cultural, at an economic, at a whatever level, and also the increasing our increasing exposure to environmental risk and climate risk, how could that be instrumentalized so that it becomes a toolkit for the climate lobby, both sort of on the activists, but also for people like yourself in client meetings. How is there a way that such a toolkit could be developed?
Because you think that, for example, as I mentioned earlier, the atmospheric concentration of CO2 is in the end what matters. As long as that increases, it's not even stabilized, it doesn't decline. It has to decline quickly. we cannot be satisfied, right? So looking at that single indicator is maybe also a good test. Do we contribute to reducing it or not? And it leads to greenhouse gas emissions too. But I think what you have in mind is more, I also mentioned the climate action tracker. If that is maybe helpful, it's more abstract, of course. It's just looking at different climate policies and how helpful they are, to what extent they contribute to the Paris Agreement and so on. But I think maybe if we need a strong argument, it's about the costs and benefits of the climate crisis, and this is what politicians will listen to. If we take the most, so we mentioned this cascading systemic effects and secondary risks, but even if you don't take them into account, the costs and damages of unmitigated climate change are so colossal compared to the gains that are so huge if we manage to transition, create good jobs, and so on. So we have this very clear cost benefit analysis also that the IPCC report points to, that should be a no-brainer, right? So maybe just hammering home that message to policymakers against the misinformation that is of course making it much more difficult. So we spoke about this, what the crisis of as a crisis of democracy, of science literacy. We have really at a time when we need this clarity on costs and benefits. We have so much confusion about it, and people who are living in different realities who, totally alien concept to them, to think that there is a climate crisis that is causing huge costs, for example, or that transition could be beneficial. They see transition as a huge, cost in itself. And so, we have to debate this. We have to find a common understanding of what it is really that is at stake and what it is that we can gain.
Yeah, absolutely. So, moving forward, I was thinking, where would we take that conversation from here? We started off talking of concepts, carbon pricing, a climate dividend, or a carbon dividend, climate income, and from there we kind of moved into this whole question of how do you operationalize that, and how do you measure whether you're actually making any progress or whether you're just going in circles with a beautiful idea. And everybody's getting excited about that idea, but we're not actually moving forward. We're not actually having any impact. So what I wonder, what would be quite interesting, and very much, if you like, in the spirit of Reboot 2030. I mean, I sort of see a kind of, and we all see a kind of a very narrow window of 10 to 15 years where a lot of stuff needs to happen if we want to credibly reach the targets we've set ourselves. So I wonder, some of the Reboot contributors are running their own, often global, whatever, initiative, and this is a natural thing to track. So I can come back and talk to John Bunsell in 2 years' time about Simpol and see how that develops, and so on and so forth. It's in our conversation, I wonder whether we could pick either one or a small basket of companies that you consider are transformative. And we build a sort of a dialogue around that. So, but really with a sort of a longer term perspective. So there was this saying, well, these companies have set themselves ambitious targets to do X, Y, and Z. And the way an analyst would look at it, or the way, we sort of see, and of course, ideally, it's not about being critical of them. In fact, the opposite. It's about, providing some inspiration and some reflection along the way. Would that be something that you could?
I would have to think about it, because I'm a bit skeptical about what single companies can do, given that there's a structural systemic change that is needed. But there are organizations that are working towards structural and systemic change, which I think is also, if you look more into those non-profits, how they're doing, that might be interesting. Yeah. And on the other hand, I also created a little framework, a little presentation on about civilizational progress and regenerative civilization was unsustainable. I would like to send you those slides perhaps you can.
Oh no, yeah, absolutely, and I'll find a way
after.
of putting it out, instead of adding it to the website so that it's available for people afterwards. Definitely. Okay. How do you feel about us kind of like just getting back to that kind of question, sort of offline, if you like, and then over the next couple of weeks or months, kind of seeing whether I totally agree. It doesn't have to be a commercial enterprise. It can very much be a not-for-profit. It can be. It doesn't even have to necessarily be a incorporated organization. It can be. It could be a network of people. But the idea being that we kind of get our teeth into a concrete problem, into a concrete, attempt to make a change. And of course, it would be good to have an organization that's given itself clear targets so that we can, let's say, well, by 2030, we need to achieve X or Y or Z. And we reflect on that and sort of, see whether they would. Do you think that's something you would, Yeah, sure. Let's do it. I think that'd be an interesting thing to do. Listen, Young-Jin, thank you very, very much. It's been great, and this time it's exactly 5 o'clock. We've been, the timing has been brilliant. So thank you very much. Do send me your slides, and I'll sort of add them to the website. Thanks a lot. And also link it obviously to this video so that people can cross-reference and see it. Looking forward to following up the conversation and developing further the idea of civilization. Excellent. Good luck with your new job. Yeah. Thanks. Bye-bye.